stood there, taking in the whole scene. I saw the elegant restaurant, the glasses of wine, the soft laughter. And there she was, the center of my world. She was sitting at the table with him, laughing, as they shared a moment of joy. I held the divorce letter in my hands. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through my veins, but my face remained unshaken. I already knew everything, every lie, every excuse, every look she gave me while hiding secrets behind a forced smile. The worst had happened. I had decided to end it in the most surgical way. I had the option of doing it in the most surgical way possible. She was unaware of my presence. I didn't know. I had already discovered everything. Her lover, the guy she said was the one she wanted, was so caught up in a game of seduction that he barely noticed what was going on around him. As I got closer, I felt the shock wave that hit her as soon as she saw me. Her face turned pale. Her lips trembled, but she did her best to stay calm. That's when I gently placed the letter on the table between her glass of wine and her plate. She looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. And in a way it was. Her eyes showed the shock she felt. But then, something incredible happened. I saw tears well up in his eyes, and I wasn't sure if they were from regret or pure despair. She tried to say something, but it was hard to decipher over the noise in the room. He tried to justify the betrayal with words that seemed pathetic as they came out of his mouth. It's not what you think.
This is your story channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please join us to stay updated with more real stories happening around you.
It's not what you think, she murmured, her voice breaking. But I didn't need to hear any more. I knew everything. I had followed. I had watched her every move, and it was heartbreaking to see her hurt me so deeply night after night. I could have done something. I could have confronted him sooner, but I chose the right time. Now the lover was there, watching the scene without understanding the full scope of what was happening. I had prepared for this. I was ready for every tear, every plea. But what she didn't know was that her betrayal was not the worst part of this story. I discovered something much greater. He was more than just a passing interest. He was an opportunist, a cheat. She was so trusting, believing she had found true love, while he saw only a chance to get rich at her expense. She never loved me the way I loved her. Now I'm about to discover the price of that choice. The weeks before, I put on a brave face, believing the excuses about late meetings, friends, and colleagues. She was so convinced that she had everything under control. But little did she know, with every excuse she came up with, I was one step ahead, gathering evidence, preparing for the moment when she would finally fall. For good. And that moment had arrived. I put the divorce letter on the table, and the lover looked at me, a bit uncomfortable. Maybe he knew his game was about to be over. Or maybe he was just too scared to deal with the fallout. Either way, that was the last time I would see him. And she had no idea what was coming next. I think you should read this, I said, gently taking her hand and pointing to the envelope. She looked at me with teary eyes, trying to maintain what dignity she had left. But her hands were shaking as she opened the paper. I could hear her. Her breathing grew faster as she read the words that would bring our marriage to a close. But what really destroyed her wasn't the divorce. That's what I said. Next. Your future with him, I said. I gestured to the man who now looked a bit uncomfortable in his chair. This man you think is going to give you a new life? He's already on the run. You think he loves you, but he just wanted your money. She blinked, confused. I followed you. For weeks. I know every penny you transferred to him, every investment you made. He deceived you. Just as you deceived. I'm hurt, and I'm angry. The effect of those words it was immediate. The lover. Until then, he'd been quiet, but then he started to move around a bit. I smiled warmly. I watched with a smile as he tried his best to keep his cool. He didn't expect that. Neither did she. She had let me down. It was like a dream that didn't exist. And now she was caught up in a web of lies that she had helped to create. The most ironic thing of all is that at the moment when she needed him most, he would leave her without. Looking back, it's heartbreaking. He's going to leave. I continued. When that happens, you'll have nothing left. I won't be there for you, And our children won't have a mom. You won't have any money either. You thought. Tears finally fell in full. Tears of regret, perhaps. But it was too late for that. She tried to call me, tried to ask for one last chance. But it was her time. She had used up all her time. The game was over. Now all she had to do was watch the house of cards she had built crumble. And I, for the first time in a long time, felt free. But then, something happened. To her, the lover ran. She left just like I did that night. It was a heartbreaking outcome, but it was something I had foreseen. But sadly, she was left to deal with the consequences. What happened to the poor woman I once loved? What did she discover after that fateful dinner? Well, you'll definitely want to know that. Welcome, my dear friend, to our little channel. Here, we're all for supporting each other and celebrating our journeys, especially when it comes to relationships. All the stories you'll hear here are fictional, but they're based on real-life experiences. We want to show you how betrayal can destroy lives and relationships in ways that can't be undone. The moral of each story is clear, and we hope you enjoy them. Those who betray always pay the price. Prepare for a heart-wrenching tale brimming with unexpected plot twists. So fasten your seatbelts, and let's dive in. It's a good story. John had been carrying the weight of responsibility ever since he got married. Sarah, from the very start, he knew that building a life together would require sacrifices, and he was ready to make every one of them. Sarah was the kind of woman who captivated everyone around her. With her brown hair and a smile that lit up any room, she seemed to be the embodiment of joy. She was the living definition of joy. She was affectionate. She was attentive, and her easy manner contrasted with John's more rigid and practical posture. They were a perfect match, and it was clear they were meant for each other. For many years, this was enough. On the outside, their life was picture-perfect, the kind of existence many dream of. They lived in a beautiful neighborhood, surrounded by friends in a close-knit community. John was a well-known lawyer who spent long hours at work fighting for causes he believed in. His office in the city was a place where he really stood out, always with a solid stance and strong ethics. Sarah, on the other hand, had a passion for the arts. She worked as an art. She was a wonderful art teacher at a local school, and she found so much fulfillment in the little things. She loved working on an unfinished painting, and she was so excited about her class of students organizing exhibitions for the town's new talents. They had 2 young children who were the center of John's universe. Their joy and affection made him forget, for a moment, the stress of work and the challenges of adult life. Their family routine was something they cherished. They would have dinner together and talk about the past, and the children would laugh and play around the table. John Proud felt a responsibility to protect the little universe they had built with such care. But even the best of families can have their challenges, and over time, John and Sarah noticed that something was missing in their relationship. They weren't at each other's throats or having massive blowouts, but there was a subtle, underlying tension. It was something. It was more subtle, as if an invisible distance had begun to settle between them. John couldn't ignore it. They weren't having the same kind of conversations they used to have. Silences, those quiet moments, once so comforting, now felt a bit overwhelming. Sarah, who had always been so open with him, now seemed distant, keeping her thoughts to herself. He tried to ignore the signs, but it wasn't easy. At first, Sarah was busy, as was he. Children needed attention, and work demanded focus. Life, at times, felt like a steady stream of routine, where grand gestures of affection might not always find a place. But deep down, John knew something was changing, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Sarah felt it too, but they felt it in different ways. She'd always been. She was a dreamer, someone who needed constant inspiration to feel alive. The routine. At first, the routine felt nice and comfortable, but now it was starting to feel a bit too much. She still loved him, John, or at least she thought she did. But deep down, she felt like there was something missing. Even though her work as a teacher was rewarding, it just didn't seem as fulfilling as it used to. The days were passing, and she was finding herself lost in distant thoughts more and more at night, searching for meaning in things she hadn't questioned before. Sometimes, She missed who she was before she got married, the freedom she had to explore the world without ties. These feelings weren't something she talked about much, openly. There was a barrier. They both sensed something wasn't quite right, but neither had the courage to face the situation. For John, talking about it would be like admitting he'd failed at something he'd sworn to protect. Their marriage, their family, the stable life they'd built together. For Sarah, it was hard to talk about. Admitting she wasn't happy would mean dealing with feelings she didn't know how to explain, even to herself. Over the past few months, things had become more and more evident. Sarah started. She was spending more time out of the house, and she always had good reasons for it. "It's just an art event," she said. "The students need me." John, ever the devoted husband, chose to believe her, or at least he did his best. It was easier that way. It was easier. It was easier to accept the explanations than to question them. Besides, he trusted her. Sarah. She had never given him any reason to doubt her. But even that, their bond was gradually becoming more fragile. At home, their relationship had become more and more mechanical. They talked about the kids' school, the bills, and what they'd do for dinner that night. Sarah, who always poured her heart and soul into their relationship, seemed to be withdrawing more and more. Every day when John looked into her eyes, and he felt like there was a part of her he no longer recognized. It was in those quiet moments when he was alone in his office at night that he felt it most acutely. John started feeling a bit unsure. Was something really wrong? Was he imagining things when he thought Sarah was pulling away? Or was it just the weight of years and responsibilities taking their toll? These thoughts kept him up at night, and he couldn't stop thinking about them. But the next day, he put on his happy face and tried to act like everything was normal. Sarah, in turn, felt torn. Deep down, she still cherished the life she had with John, the children, the stability, the respect she felt for him. But there was another part of her that felt a bit restless and uneasy. She longed for something different, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She started reaching out to friends, some more liberal, some more conservative, seeking advice and support. But no answer seemed to fit the emptiness she felt. The city where they had lived for so many years didn't seem to have the same charm. For Sarah, every street, every cafe, every park brought back memories of a time when everything seemed perfect, but now made her feel trapped in a life she no longer recognized. She didn't want to hurt John. She knew that. He was a good man, and the children were, too. They were everything to her. But there was this nagging feeling, this unease, like something was missing. As time went on, John tried his best to reconnect with Sarah in small ways. He suggested. They went out together more, planned family trips, and arranged surprises for her. But Sarah, no matter how much she wanted to, couldn't let herself fully open up. It was an effort she was making. She felt guilty, and it was weighing on her. But at the same time, she felt like something inside her had been dormant for too long. She felt alone. On that particular day, John came home late. He'd been working late at the office. He'd been called to deal with an urgent matter at the office, and it was already night when he entered the house. When he got home, he found the lights were out and the house was unusually quiet. Sarah was often out socializing with friends or attending work events, but this feeling of emptiness was especially troubling for John. He checked his phone. There were no messages or calls. He climbed the stairs. As he climbed the stairs to his room, John couldn't shake the thought that had been nagging at him for weeks. Something was changing. Something was about to happen. He wasn't sure what it was, but he had a feeling that the life he knew wasn't going to be the same. The distance between John and Sarah was growing. Every day it seemed to grow a little more. It was heartbreaking to see the emptiness in her eyes. The emptiness in her gestures, once so full of affection, was becoming more and more obvious. John couldn't help but notice. It was clear to him, even as he tried his best to keep the peace at home, that something was off. The silence in the room, the excuses for not being together, the lost looks from Sarah as he spoke, all of it building an invisible wall. Between them, he tried to hide. He felt uneasy, but a storm began to grow. Inside him, John understood. Something was deeply stirring within him, but he was wrong. The excuses, for Sarah's long trips away. The reasons for Sarah's prolonged absences became less clear. There was always a reason, something that couldn't be helped, a new excuse that, with each time, felt a bit more far-fetched. He wanted to believe her. I had to believe, but my gut told me something else. Over the years, he'd learned to listen for it in his work as a lawyer. He knew the truth was out there, just waiting to be found. As time went on, John's mind was working nonstop, trying to make sense of it all. He found himself scanning her gestures, analyzing the words she said more carefully. Sarah seemed more distant than ever when they were together as a family. She seemed out of place, almost as if she were living another life far away. He tried his best to be a part of the family's usual activities, but it felt like she was worlds away. John felt like he was trying to battle something invisible, something he still couldn't put his finger on. One rainy afternoon, as John was coming back from work, he had the first concrete evidence that something was really wrong. John was heading home from work when he got the first clue that something was really off. As he walked, passing through a street near the center, he saw Sarah enter a cafe with a man he didn't know. At first, it didn't seem suspicious at all. It could be a work meeting or a casual encounter. But their behavior, there was a closeness that disturbed him deeply. The way she touched his arm, the stifled laughter, there was something special about it. He couldn't ignore it. John paused. The car on the other side of the street, his heart. His heart was pounding as he felt a racing sensation. The uncertainty. He had been feeling this way for months. That nagging feeling had been gnawing at him for months, and now it was about to be confirmed. He stood there, watching from a distance with a mixture of pain and disbelief. How could Sarah do this to him? She was the woman he had sworn to love and protect, the mother of his children. They had a beautiful life together. They were a family. It was hard to accept the possibility that it was all falling apart before their eyes, that she was with someone else. The heartwarming moment in the cafe lasted a bit longer than John would have liked. They talked for almost an hour, laughing and exchanging looks. There was no longer any way to deny what was happening. Sarah was having an affair. The reality was clear and brutal. It was a lot to take in, and he felt like his chest was being crushed from the inside. But he didn't react, not at that moment. Instead, he took a step back, processed the information, and started thinking about his next steps. He felt a dull ache in his chest, a sign of the hurt he felt from the betrayal, though it hadn't fully been exposed yet. In the days that followed, John watched Sarah's movements more closely. He didn't want to confront her directly, at least not yet. I knew I needed proof. I needed to be sure before I took any steps. He started to look into things. He was careful and discreet. He asked mutual friends to analyze her social networks, checked her bank accounts for suspicious transactions. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for. He found messages exchanged on her cell phone, meetings scheduled at times when she said she was at work, and expensive gifts he'd never seen. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a truth he had always feared but never wanted to admit. As he learned more, John's heart grew cold. The initial pain was replaced by a feeling of coldness. He knew the end was near and began to plan the final blow. If Sarah was willing to destroy everything they'd built together, he would make sure she paid. John didn't think there was any hope for talking things through or working things out. The betrayal had left a deep, lasting wound that could not be easily healed. That week, Sarah continued to act as if nothing had happened. She still smiled at her children, pretending life was going on as normal. But John knew the truth, and with every gesture she made, he felt a bitter taste of irony. How could she live with herself? How could she look him in the eye and continue this charade? Deep down, John was about to lose it, but he kept it together. He was calm. I knew I needed to wait for the right moment. It was a Saturday night when it all came to light. And then, bam, it all unfolded. She said she was going to a meeting with friends, which was typical for a weekend night. But John, our dear John, already knew the truth. He had hired a private investigator to follow her. And that night he received photos that confirmed what he already suspected. Sarah wasn't. She wasn't with her friends. She was with him, the man from the cafe, laughing and sharing a night that should have been theirs. John felt a range of emotions when he saw the pictures, including anger and pain. It was confirmation of what he had felt for weeks, but now it was real. Sarah was unfaithful to him. The man she was with whom she shared glances and laughter, was responsible for the destruction of their marriage. John stayed. He sat there silently for hours, lost in thought as he studied the photos, as if trying to make sense of the passage of time. Had stopped. At the end of that night, after a while, John made a decision. There was no turning back. The love he had for Sarah, the trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship, had been completely destroyed. He knew that from then on, things would never be the same. John knew that night was going to be tough. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders, but he also felt a strange sense of relief at finally being able to end it. This cycle. Dinner was ready. He had planned everything, every detail carefully calculated so that the truth would come out in a devastating way. Sarah had. He had no idea what was about to happen. He felt safe and secure. In his bubble of lies, he believed he could continue to live his double life without consequence. As John put on his suit, he stared at his reflection. In the mirror, his eyes, they showed the exhaustion from weeks of not sleeping and spending hours in quiet vigilance. He couldn't quite place when his love for Sarah had turned into something so distant. There was no more anger. What remained was a deep sense of sadness. Now, he was determined to uncover the truth and close that chapter of his life with dignity. He wanted justice, not revenge. At least that's what he tried to convince himself. Sarah, on the other hand, was calm. For her, this night was just another night to meet Peter, the man she had secretly come to call her future. For months, she had been carried away by an illusion. She believed that with Peter, she would finally have the exciting life she so desired. He was charming, attentive, and seemed completely taken with her. It was the opposite of the routine security she was used to. John offered. Sarah saw in Peter a chance to break free and start over. Sarah saw an escape, a chance to start over, away from the predictability of marriage. When John arrived at the restaurant, he was greeted by the comforting sense of delicious food and the soothing sounds of ambient music. The elegant setting was full of couples chatting discreetly, most lost in their own worlds. But Peter was focused on just one person. Sarah. Peter. He was sure he knew exactly where they were sitting. He had seen their names on the reservation. This made him feel sure that tonight, the farce would finally end. He walked through the restaurant with steady, confident steps, his heart filled with anticipation. When he finally saw them, his stomach gave a little knock. There they were, laughing carelessly. Sarah looked absolutely radiant in the blue dress John had given her for their anniversary. It was a poignant moment, as if she was gently mocking him with the very memory of what they had once been. He took a few seconds to gather his thoughts before approaching. "Good evening," he said, his voice warm. "Good evening," John said with a gentle smile as he placed the divorce letter on the table among the wine glasses. Sarah's gaze instantly froze. Her eyes widened as she saw him standing there, as if the ground had been pulled out from under her feet. Peter, on the other hand, tried to hide his discomfort, but it was clear that he didn't know what to do. John stood. He stood firmly, showing no sign of losing control. "What are you doing here?" Sarah stammered, her voice quivering with emotion. "Finish what you started," Sarah replied to John with controlled coolness. "Open the envelope," he said kindly. The room fell silent. The tension in the air was palpable. Sarah took the white envelope with trembling hands and opened it. As his eyes ran over the words, his expression changed from shock to despair. Tears began to well up in his eyes. But these weren't tears of regret. It was the cry of someone who knew it was all over. "No, it doesn't have to be like this." He tried to argue, but his voice was weak. "Yes, you do, Sarah," John replied firmly. "You've made your choices. Now it's time to live with the consequences." Peter, who had been quiet until then, decided to step in. "I think this This is something you should work out in private too, he said, trying to get up from the table. But John stopped him before he could take another step. Stay where you are, he said kindly. John's voice, his tone was firm but also caring. You're a part of this, after all. You were involved in all this too. Have you? Peter's face showed a hint of sadness. He wasn't fooled. He was taken aback by the confrontation, especially from someone he thought was just a victim. But he didn't expect this. What he didn't know was that John was one step ahead. It wasn't just about exposure, betrayal. There was something else there, too. It was something bigger, something Sarah hadn't discovered yet. And that was the moment to reveal. John moved. He moved closer to the table and looked directly into Sarah's eyes. But then his gaze shifted, and he looked away. Then he turned to Peter. It was as if he was taking in all of Peter, trying to understand him. Do you think you know the man next to you, Sarah? John asked with a warm smile. His voice was warm and reassuring. His words carried weight. Sarah looked at him, confused. He wiped away the tears streaming down her face. She was still trying to understand. John's words. What are you talking about? She looked at him. Peter, searching for an answer, remained silent. This man, Peter, is your future. He's not who you think he is. With a warm smile, John continued. He's a bit of a riddle, isn't he? Just like you fooled me, Sarah. And, in a twist of irony, he's actually the one leaving you. He was about to leave you, too. That's so funny. Peter replied, trying to keep control of the situation. I don't need to hear this, he added, his voice gentle. It's not easy for me right now. John replied with a calm expression, his voice tinged with concern. Because I know exactly who you are, John replied. Peter. Sarah looked from one to the other, not quite sure what was going on. Peter's discomfort was clear. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if he wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. But he knew he couldn't just get up and leave. Have you ever wondered how this man came into your life? Conveniently, you might say, how he always seems to be there when you need him. It's almost as if he had the perfect answer to everything you needed, wanted to hear. John leaned slightly on the table, his presence a comfort. Because, Sarah, he's a con man, a liar, a freeloader who used you to get what he really wanted, your money. John's words felt like a sharp knife cutting through the air. Sarah blinked, trying to process what he had said. She looked at him. Peter, waiting for him to deny it, to say something that would make it seem like a big lie. But Peter remained silent, his face a mask of containment. Sarah stammered, staring at Peter, now beginning to realize what was happening. This can't be. This is real. Peter tried to calm down, but it was too late. The truth had already come out. Exposed. There was no longer any way to hide what he had done. Really. I looked into you, Peter. I found out who you really are, the scams you pulled on other women, and the deceitful deals you involved Sarah in. Did you think you could get away with it? Get away with it? But John was not. Sarah dropped the envelope, totally shocked, and sat back in her chair, as if she'd been hit in the stomach. Her eyes welled up with tears, but this time, it was different. This time, her tears weren't born of regret. She was crying because she realized she had been betrayed twice. I trusted you, she whispered, looking at Peter, her voice breaking. Peter finally broke the silence, his expression now hardened. Sarah, he began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. No, he shouted, his voice full of anger and pain. You used me. John watched, his heart going out to Peter. It was a poignant scene, a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He knew this moment would come, but seeing Sarah so hurt by her own choices didn't bring him the joy he'd expected. Peter, realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation, quickly got up from the table. He knew there was nothing more he could do. His cover had been blown, and he had nothing left to gain here. It's over, John said calmly as he watched Peter leave the restaurant without looking back. Sarah stood there alone, her hands shaking, her eyes red from crying, staring into space. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted completely after Peter left. His actions had a clear impact on everyone, and it was evident in the way he moved about. Toward the door, the usual sounds of the restaurant, like clinking cutlery and discreet conversation, seemed muffled to John and Sarah, who remained seated, lost in the emotional turmoil that had just been unleashed. Sarah was stunned, tears drying on her cheeks as she tried to process what had just happened. John, on the other side of the table, remained calm. But inside, a storm of conflicting emotions was forming. There was no victory, at least not the one he had imagined. He had hoped that by exposing Peter and Sarah's betrayal, he would feel a sense of relief, a sense of release. But now he felt differently. As he looked at the devastated face of the woman he had shared so many years with, he realized that the situation was far more painful and complex than he could have ever imagined. He had not foreseen this. What he saw before him wasn't just a traitor, but a woman who had been doubly betrayed, a woman who had lost everything. Her trust, her love, and now her hope. Her eyes, once so bright and alive, now seemed distant, as if she was drowning in his guilt and shame. After a long pause, neither of them knew how to say anything. Sarah, tried to speak, but her voice failed, caught in a tangle of emotions. How could I be so foolish? John didn't respond right away. He asked himself the same question, but not out of any sense of superiority. There was something else going on, something deeper that was bothering him. How had they gotten to this point? He was not. He was just the victim of a betrayal, but part of a relationship that had disintegrated bit by bit while he watched from a distance without doing anything. Action. You're lost, Sarah John said finally, her voice low, but firm. And so am I. She looked up at him, surprised. Him in surprise. This unexpected confession touched her in a way that no accusation or confrontation had done before. What he whispered, it was almost as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. All these years, he continued, I've been distancing myself. His voice was barely above a whisper as he continued. All these years I've been distancing myself. I was so busy keeping up appearances, so focused on making sure our lives were perfect, that I didn't notice when you started to pull away. I just ignored the signs. I didn't want to face what was wrong, but deep down, I knew it was there. Sarah shook her head, trying to hold back more tears, but they came anyway. She knew she'd made mistakes that couldn't be fixed. But hearing John admit his own share of the blame made her see the situation differently. She saw it differently. It wasn't just a matter of betrayal. It was the failure. It was about a relationship that didn't know how to adapt to change, that didn't reinvent itself when it needed to. But that doesn't justify what you did. John added his voice, returning to a more stern tone. I was here and you chose. I was here, and you chose to betray me. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. He dominated again. Sarah looked down at the table, feeling a bit overwhelmed. She knew he was right. There was a big difference between the mistakes he recognized and the betrayal she had. She felt a sense of remorse and regret for the mistakes she had made. Now, all that was left was the emptiness of his choices. You can still change things, John said. After a long moment, he took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I'm not saying, we can't go back, though, to the way we were. That's in the past. But I'm here for you, and I encourage you to be honest with yourself. You can try to fix what's left. She looked at him, confused. Fix what? She asked, her voice warm with concern. I don't have anything left, he replied, his voice gentle. You do, John replied, looking deep into her eyes. Our children, they still need you. I'm not sure how. I'm sure we can figure this out, but they shouldn't have to pay the price for our mistakes. The mention of her children broke something inside Sarah. The pain of betrayal mixed with regret for the effect his actions might have on them. Sarah had been so consumed by her own need for something new, for an escape, that she hadn't stopped to consider the broader consequences of her choices. She didn't consider how her decisions would affect the people she loved most. John watched, seeing the effect his words were having. He knew that the pain Sarah felt at that moment was legitimate, but he knew that she needed to face the truth, just as he had. done. She needed to. She had to face what she had destroyed and find a way to rebuild, even if it was just for herself and her child. Children, what about you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you going to do now? The question hung in the air, and John didn't have an immediate answer. All I knew was that right now I needed some space to think and process everything that had happened. He looked at her. Sarah felt a strange mixture of pity and compassion. She was broken, but somehow so was he. I don't know yet, John, he admitted. But I need time. We need time. She nodded her head in agreement. Slowly, she understood that the wounds opened that night would take time to heal, if they ever did. Completely, the moral dilemma was clear. For both of them, Sarah, who was clearly devastated, had to decide how to rebuild her life from the ashes of her choices. She had fallen victim to a con, but at the same time she had also been the agent of her own destruction. How could she move forward? How could she find the strength to forgive herself? And how could she move forward? She had to move forward, even though she knew that her selfish pursuit of something more had led to the ruin of everything. She knew it for John. The decision was no less complex. He knew that even though he wanted to separate himself from Sarah, there was an unbreakable bond between them and their children. He couldn't just leave. There was so much more at stake than just a little hurt pride or a broken marriage. He rose slowly from the table, pulling on his coat as Sarah watched him in silence with a look of restrained despair. I'll watch the kids this week, John said calmly. You've got as much time as you need to think, to compose yourself. Sarah nodded, still finding the words to reply. She knew he was trying to be fair, but she also knew the road ahead would be hard. There were no promises of reconciliation, no guarantees. Promises of reconciliation, no guarantees that they would ever be able to rebuild what they had destroyed. What remained was an uncomfortable silence, heavy with the weight of all that had been said and done that night. John took the first step toward the door. He felt the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He didn't look back. There was a poignant quality about him, as if this moment marked the conclusion of a chapter in his life, a chapter he had never anticipated losing. Sarah, on the other hand, sat for a few minutes after. John had left. His world had irrevocably changed. Felt like his world had fallen apart. She had lost. Everything had changed in one moment. Her husband, her lover, and maybe even herself. Now, she had to figure out how to move forward, making choices that would guide her to a new path. As the restaurant's lights gradually dimmed, a new silence enveloped them. Her future was uncertain, and she felt a bit hungover, both physically and emotionally. The days following that fateful dinner were a blur. Sarah. She retreated into a deep silence, isolating herself from the world. Around her, John had left home with the kids, as he'd promised, and now she was on her own, facing the echo of her choices. The days were long. The nights felt endless. Sarah walked. She walked through the empty house, thinking about the memories of a marriage that was now just a memory. The pictures on the walls seemed to be laughing at her, reminding her that even in the happy moments captured in those photos, their relationship was already fading. She gazed at her reflection, seeing a woman who had been broken, both by Peter's betrayal and by her own actions. He had betrayed the man who had been by his side for years, and now he was paying the price. She felt so regretful, but what was weighing her down the most was the realization that even if she had made different choices, the emptiness she had felt for so long would still be there. Maybe it was a feeling that no one could ever truly fill. Meanwhile, John was grappling with his own challenges. Demons. Having the kids with him brought some comfort, but the weight of failure continued to haunt him. The divorce. The legal issues were important, but what worried him most was the impact it would have on his children. He watched them play and laugh, innocent and carefree, unaware that their lives were about to change. Forever. John knew he needed to be strong for them, but there was a deep pain he tried to ignore, something only time could heal. Sarah tried her best to be strong for them, but she, too, felt a deep pain that only time could heal. She tried to talk to him several times. John. She wanted to explain. She wanted to explain. She wanted to apologize. but she knew that no words could correct what she had done. Their conversations were short and functional, and always centered around the kids. The children, the distance between them. With each phone call and text, the distance between them seemed to grow. It was as if, after so many years of closeness, they were now complete. They were like strangers. It was a chilly afternoon, a few weeks after the divorce proceedings began, that Sarah found the strength to step outside, ready to face the world. She went to school to pick up her children, knowing that John would be there. When she saw him standing by the car, she felt something inside her break. Once again, his eyes showed no anger. He looked resigned. She felt sad. He greeted her warmly, with a nod, and for a moment, it seemed as if the two of them had stopped being husband and wife and had become just parents, united by the love of their children and nothing else. They watched as their children ran toward the car, their laughter filling the air as if nothing had ever been a problem. It was a heartwarming sight, even if it was a little disconcerting. Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she realized that no matter how hard she tried, she could never go back. The children, though young, would begin to notice that something was different, and that realization was too painful to ignore. John, on the other hand, was laser-focused on moving forward. He knew that the pain of betrayal would stay with him for a while, but the coldness of knowing that he had been betrayed by two people at once, his wife and the man who betrayed her, hardened him in an irreversible way. He promised himself that he would never let anyone hurt him like that again. His heart, once as big and open as a mountain, had slowly closed off, protected by a wall of mistrust that would be hard to break through. After weeks of feeling isolated, Sarah decided it was time to seek support. He decided to seek therapy, not just to deal with the divorce, but also to try to understand where he had lost his way. She knew the problem went beyond just betrayal. It was a deep-seated dissatisfaction with herself that had led her to make destructive choices. The road to healing would be long, and she was willing to take it, even though she knew the path would be lonely. As for Peter, his life had taken a predictable path. After being exposed, he fled. As you might have guessed, that's exactly what happened. The scam he planned against Sarah, but it didn't work out the way he'd hoped. Still, he tried it on someone else. He just couldn't help himself. He was always on the lookout for a new victim, someone vulnerable enough to fall into his web of lies. But, you see, his destiny was already set. It was inevitable that justice would catch up with him. John and Sarah, they went their separate ways, but they never truly freed themselves from each other because of the children that brought them together. Over time, the pain of betrayal turned into acceptance. Sarah gradually rebuilt her life, while John, understandably, retreated more into himself, focusing on his career and his children. Despite their differences, they shared a deep love for each other. Their love may have faded, but the impact of everything they had been through would never be forgotten. But they're not forgotten. Sarah looked to the future with hope, knowing that her choices had completely changed her path. She was no longer the woman who dreamed of a perfect life with a man in love. Now, she had to face the truth of who she really was and find a way to live with it. John, too, felt a loss, though he wouldn't say it out loud. He missed the simplicity of the past, when he believed that love could overcome anything. Now he knew that some wounds are too deep to heal with time alone. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's also about the consequences of our choices and the complexity of human emotion. Cheating isn't just about breaking someone's trust. It's about breaking not just the other person but yourself too. The heartbreak can be so deep that it's almost impossible to recover from. It's heartbreaking to think that the damage we cause can be so irreversible. We'd love to know what you thought of it. Please share your thoughts with us. We're curious to know how you felt listening to this journey of mistakes, regrets, and new beginnings. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. We're all in this together, and together, we can create a space where we support each other and learn from our mistakes. All of these stories are meant to teach us a valuable lesson. This kind of behavior can destroy lives. Until next time, we hope you're doing well.